I was raised by women, on welfare, and my mother was an unsophisticated third-world woman. But the similarity to many of today's single-teen welfare mothers stops there, because my mother and her sisters were far different from today's evolutionary disgrace of broodmares. While we weren't wealthy in material things, my mother and aunts endowed me with the priceless strength of my heritage. They endowed me with the hope of the American dream and the will to achieve it. Despite all of our struggles, my mother maintained an unwavering belief in her ability to do better than welfare for herself and for her children. Besides her pipe dreams of hitting the number, she had dreams for personal accomplishments and successes which would enable her to break away from government dependency. In spite of her being naive and our frequent economic difficulties, the constant in our lives was that she held on to hope. My mother and her sisters never allowed themselves to become resigned to a lifetime of poverty on account of being victims. They'd been sent to America, after all, for a better life than they could have hoped for back home on an isolated island. They loved this country and always told us we could and should become proud Americans. My mother told me in no uncertain terms that I could succeed in America. She and my aunts told me education was the key. "Stay in school, get yourself a good education," was their mantra. I never heard anyone in my family ever speak ill of education. I admit I hated school, be it parochial or public. One reason probably was that while I don't recall being the subject of a lot of prejudice, I do know that school was one place where my poverty showed. I have a vivid, sickening recollection of being taunted by other kids because I wore my mother's laced shoes to school at the end of winter one year after my own had worn out. And my defiant attitude today may be due in part to a teacher who told my mother, in my presence, that I'd be in prison by the time I was 17. But my mother didn't hold a protest rally in front of the school or take a complaint about the teacher to the local NAACP. She never made excuses for me because we were poor. She just continued to encourage all of us kids to get an education and to make better lives for ourselves. Even as a poor black single mother in the 1940s and 50s, she sincerely believed anything was possible in America. Sadly, today, those broodmares who become mothers before their time can provide no legacy of strength and dreams to their children, because with each succeeding welfare generation, they have less substance to draw upon. We began tearing down the stigma of illegitimate births on TV talk shows hosted by supposedly compassionate liberals like Phil Donahue. They provided a credible platform for the psychobabble that bemoaned the trauma we inflict on innocent bastard babies when we stigmatize their immoral and primitive mothers. Gradually, instead of banishing pregnant girls from school, it was advocated that not only they, but their newborn babies stay. School nurseries were built to provide daycare for student mothers. The theory was that this girl, now more than ever, needed an education. In the end, we've altered our community values and disrupted our once orderly educational system to make it convenient for broodmares to have the same access to school as good girls do. What kind of example is that? Whenever I address the problem of black trash teen mothers on my radio show or in my syndicated newspaper column, inevitably I get calls and letters reminding me that there are fathers somewhere who need to be held just as accountable for these babies as their young mothers. To them I say, what a joke. I'm well versed in the basics of biology, thank you. But it's the mother, a product of the black trash welfare culture, who's been bred to expect the government will take care of her babies just as the government took care of her and most likely her mother. These generations of broodmares are the valve of the welfare crises. They are the machine that perpetuates the black welfare roles with more and more new dependents, multiplying welfare generations with what was once unimaginable speed. They produce innocent babies and use them as pawns for their own lazy existence. These mothers ask with brazen bluntness and mock poignancy, "Who's going to take care of my babies? It simply never occurs to them that they should be asking themselves that question before they have more babies. But the liberal Democrats know the impact of such a query, especially when it's delivered by this poor black girl, this symbol of downtrodden Americana. The Democrats determined that the threat of starving babies was the hot button they could hit when all of their other flawed logic failed to persuade the American public that the welfare budget had to be kept intact. As the welfare debate in Congress heated up, full-page advertisements with editorial-style headlines ran in the New York Times. Here's one from May of 1995, run by the National Committee on Child Nutrition, based in San Francisco. A stark and urgent warning about hunger and malnutrition. Will Congress let our children go hungry? It showed an unflattering close-up of a grim-faced Newt Gingrich, along with the symbolic hollow-eyed face of a little boy. All of this in the name of preserving the dysfunctional lifestyle of broodmares. It's these young women, counterparts of the social crusader black thugs, who play a pivotal role in perpetuating the black trash welfare culture. Together, as they build generation upon generation, they are reinforcing and intensifying social culture that threatens the proven American way. The first time I rode along with the police gang unit through inner-city sections of Aurora, Colorado, it struck me that the people I saw there were not part of the 20th century. Instead, they appeared to be living by the standards of the Dark Ages. There was a lack of regard for the rights of other people, their right to peace and quiet, their right to property, their right to a secure environment, and a seeming lack of regard for the value of life itself. The black trash there, the black thugs and the broodmares were isolated in a community shut off from the advancements and the potential of the American community around it. I began calling these ghettos dark towns. Dark town is any place, USA, where your child might come home in a body bag because he or she wore the wrong color headband or jacket on the street. Any place where your youngest baby might be shot down by random violence. Any place where mothers put their children to bed at night in a pig iron bathtub to save them from the flying bullets as they sleep. I call these ghettos dark town because of the ignorance and the ugliness that predominates there, not to imply the racial designation of its residents. I have seen predominantly white, black, Hispanic, and Asian dark towns within cities across America. But the fact is that a great many darktown communities are inhabited predominantly by black trash. Why won't black trash leave Darktown? Because they're held captive by what I call the myth of the hobbled black. Simply put, the myth is that blacks cannot make it in America because they are black. They can't get a good job. They can't go where there are too many white people, where they are in the minority, for fear of being stopped by the police. They believe they're not welcome to live in good neighborhoods or to visit America's vacation lands. They believe they remained hobbled by their skin color today just as they were shackled as slaves more than a century ago. Well, I contend the slave generation is dead, and that every black American who survived slavery should kneel before an elder and be knighted an American hero. We are survivors, not victims. Not only have we survived, but today we're living in a country where we are sampling the nectar of our successes. Black people have become governors and police chiefs, mayors and lawyers, doctors and dentists. The slave ship is no longer relevant. But since slavery, a liberal movement has grown out of an environment where America was trying to say, I'm sorry, mea culpa. This liberal political movement grew to an extreme, and out of it has grown the black trash welfare culture, which today breeds people who have no knowledge or conscious tie to their immediate past. They can't tell you who Harriet Tubman was, or what the debate between Marcus Garvey and George Washington Carver concerned. They can't tell you anything more about Detroit Red than the X in Malcolm X. Armed only with a perception of the wrongs perpetrated against them, and with no knowledge of the history of the successful struggle to right these wrongs, they cannot grasp the promise of the American dream. That forward-thinking message is not being sent to the children of Darktown, the children of black trash. And people, like water, seek the level of the environment around them. If young people are encouraged to believe that pursuing an education is a wasted effort because they are black and the majority culture won't give them a break, they won't go to school and they won't learn. If your only expectation in life is the government dole, then you just wait for things to come to you. For food stamps, the crack, the gin. You live with the garbage, the fights. You don't do anything for yourself. The residents of Darktown are like single-cell animals with nerve systems that don't match those of people working to get ahead, working as a waiter, maybe working a second job, trying to get through school. It's a matter of common sense, a common-sense American truth, that you must set your sights on some higher goal and then strive to earn your way to reach that goal in order to gain dignity and self-esteem. Fighting the good fight affords you a sense of purpose and the resilience to run the gauntlet of life. Just as any third world country, where the people bustle about from dawn to dusk but collect no official paychecks, there's an underground commerce run by the gangs and thriving in Darktown. Much of it revolves around drugs. I once heard a black woman argue that young African-American men had a legitimate right to sell drugs because that was their way of getting into business. She contended that they were excluded by white bosses from the opportunity to become junior executives with General Motors. So, she reasoned they had no choice but to engage in commerce where they could find it. By her logic, I guess you could say these corner drug dealers were nothing more than the ace hardware store managers of their community. But despite the absurdity of her argument, no one at the gathering challenged her statement. Perhaps they were afraid to. Of course, there is some commerce in Darktown besides drug sales. Although most poor, uneducated black trash have a dysfunctional attitude toward business in general, even toward black-owned businesses in their community, black merchants who set up shop in Darktown are very interesting creatures, however. Seldom do they reach out and appeal to any broad base of customers. For the most part, I've observed that they advertise little, even in the black press or on black radio stations. The black merchant tends to depend on word of mouth, and the black merchant industry in the ghetto can be broken down into no more than a handful of businesses: beauty shops, barber shops, cleaners, mom-and-pop groceries, and liquor stores. Seldom do you see restaurants, other than a few greasy spoons and drugstores, hardware stores, service stations, businesses that offer the basic necessities for a mass audience of consumers are few and far between. Let me place this in context. Think about what business conveniences you expect to be nearby. Within walking distance of my home is a major supermarket, a hardware store, a card shop, a barber shop, 2 gas stations, an espresso shop, several restaurants including fast food chains, a flower store, 2 video rental stores, and a couple of bookstores, the kind of businesses you seldom find in Darktown. If they were magically to appear there, the periodic community uprisings by black trash would be one thing that would make their long-term prognosis poor. During periods of looting, there's an equal opportunity grab for the merchandise, followed by an equal opportunity torching, which black trash never see as an infraction of the law or an action that would reflect poorly on the community. Instead, the looters justify the lawlessness as a legitimate form of social retribution taken by the community against the inflated prices poor people are forced to pay in inner-city stores, whether the merchants are Korean, Jewish, white, or even black. So the bottom line is that welfare, drugs, and crime drive Darktown, and none of these are healthy enterprises that can function as paths to realizing the American dream. Several years ago, I was talking about the depravity of the ghetto on my Denver radio show, and a woman called to challenge me. I told her I refuse to pretend that there's a cultural superiority to an outhouse as compared to indoor plumbing. I'm not going to choose the well or the creek over fresh-running tap water. It's absurd. It defies common sense. After wrangling with me for several minutes, she announced with great finality that the ghetto is beautiful. I've carried that comment with me since then. I can only conclude that when people isolate themselves, when they begin to fear the unknown beyond their self-imposed boundaries, when they embrace the myth of the hobbled black, they become blind to reality. When I was growing up poor, I was committed to doing anything possible to get off welfare and to get out of the ghetto. I refused to settle for poverty in America. But when you live in Darktown today, morality and common sense are turned upside down. For its inhabitants, poverty and violence, ripping the system off and living off the dole, are proof that you are fighting the good fight against the white man's system. The American dream is jive and is replaced by the hallucination of a Back to Africa movement. The shame associated with charity has been replaced by a bogus badge of honor which they wear as the martyred underclass, playing out the myth of the hobbled black. They cry out they shouldn't have to suffer like they do. But I say, yes, you do. You're poor. Your life is hell. You have to understand that you have chosen a lesser quality of life. You cannot have what we who have embraced the American dream with all of its hard work and rewards have. You haven't worked for it. We have to communicate that if you maintain a victim mentality, you will die. This is America. You can be whatever you want. People are not victims just because they themselves have made bad choices. White people and mainstream blacks like me are not oppressing them. If they don't learn to reach for the American dream, the children of Darktown will have a grim inheritance. Welfare programs, federal handouts, premature pregnancy, the penitentiary, and an early grave. With all the problems of Darktown, it is almost impossible to ignore the need for reform. In state after state, legislators are feeling pressure from constituents who are fed up with subsidizing the lowly lifestyle of today's most visible welfare community. But the Democrat and Republican approaches to reform are as different as day and night. The Democrats, led by the president and his band of liberals, seem to believe that the solution is to put dignity into the welfare system, and thus instill dignity in welfare recipients. But to me, trying to make welfare a normal and accepted lifestyle works in stark opposition to their objective of restoring human dignity. The Republican approach to reform, most notably presented by Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, takes what I characterize as a tough love approach, through measures immediately labeled draconian by some, such as placing certain children of welfare mothers in orphanages. The theory is that every measure of dignity would be taken out of welfare, and thus, logically, people would want off of it. While I agree with many of their measures, the Republicans, because of their historic mantle as the political party of the cold, calculating rich, are scrutinized for their motives and thus have failed to mobilize adequate popular support or political votes in Congress for their hard-nosed solutions. The reality is that there are no neat solutions to the welfare predicament and to the black trash welfare culture. It has metamorphosed into something so grotesque that I liken it to a 500-pound canary with atrophied wings. There's no gentle way to extricate that canary from its nest, even though we know that the canary is killing, not incubating the eggs. You can't tickle it, you can't prod it, it won't go on a diet. That 500-pound bird cannot fly, and when eventually we push it out of the nest, it's going to make one big nasty mess at the base of the tree. It's going to die. But America has to make a decision. We have to deal conclusively and soon with that continually growing canary. Most likely, we will lose the canary, but I believe we have to make a choice in favor of the eggs, a choice in favor of the healthy growth and the historic promise of America's young. Whitey will pay. That is the overriding political platform of many black urban politicians, the ones I've dubbed poverty pimps. They stake their political careers on knowing that Whitey will pay because of his guilt and because of his fear. Poverty pimps are the grossest beneficiaries and purveyors of the myth of the hobbled black. In fact, they probably should be held accountable for actually creating the myth which purports that black people can't get ahead in America because white people have kept and continue to keep them down. That premise is what generates the guilt that, in turn, produces the dollars for their districts. They know that urban unrest can swell quickly to capture the attention of the national media, and that exposure has an impact on the future economic well-being of a city as a whole. And this knowledge is what allows poverty pimps to become the brokers, the middlemen between the government and the people in Darktown. These poverty pimps have convinced their constituencies, made up in large part of black trash, to settle for the dead-end political spoils of government welfare. They devote entire political careers to procuring more welfare and more poverty program dollars for their stagnant districts. They seem uninterested in genuine development. They help foster the pathological xenophobia of black trash, advocating that their constituents further estrange themselves from mainstream America by preaching the anti-American doctrine common in these African-American communities. When caught at their various crimes and misdemeanors, they cry racism, to be judged by the standards of equality that the civil rights movement fought to achieve just 3 short decades ago. Instead, they march right down to Darktown and call a meeting in the street or in a church and preach that they are being pursued and investigated only because they are black. This never would happen, they cry out, to a white mayor or a white city councilman or a white congressman. Marion Barry, the mayor of Washington, D.C., is a man who fits my definition of a poverty pimp to a T. When you characterize Barry that way, it's not surprising that he was reelected in spite of his drug conviction and jail term. To Washington's Darktown community of illegal black thug drug traffickers, he was a role model, especially when he declared that the justice system was unfair for convicting him after he was recorded on videotape using crack in a Washington hotel room. The experience of going to jail was one Barry shared with many black males in his city. So he simply played to his constituency and blamed the white establishment just as they do, and he was reelected. But in 1995, less than a year after he was back in office, things got so bad that the city ran out of toilet paper. That's right. According to a story from Associated Press, there was neither toilet paper nor paper towels in the 37 municipal buildings in Washington because the city had failed to pay the supplier. The poverty pimps elected to office are only part of the poverty pimpdom in the black political scene. They operate in tandem with a legion of community activists who do their bidding in Darktown. These activists, who are akin to old-time political ward healers, receive political patronage in return for their allegiance and push a similar message: whitey's bad, whitey's to blame. Their racial teachings have become so extreme and so outlandish that they are stimulating very bizarre occurrences. Al Sharpton, a New York minister and prominent community activist, has been in the news often over the last decade, always championing the purported racial underdog. When a white woman jogger was brutally attacked in New York Central Park, Sharpton marched down to the Justice Center to defend the suspect black thugs who, by their admission, had just been out wilding. Rather than using his powerful community voice to speak out against this senseless and atrocious violence and to draw a definitive line between right and wrong, Sharpton instead ended up declaring that this white woman, the victim, should have known better than to have been in the park at night. Later, Sharpton played a rabble-rouser in the racial showdown in which blacks and whites took to the streets in the predominantly white Brooklyn neighborhood of Bensonhurst, and he was fingered as an agitator in the more recent torching of a Jewish clothing store in Harlem. Perhaps Sharpton's most famous crusade was in 1987 on behalf of a 15-year-old black girl from Wappingers Falls, New York, named Tawana Brawley. Brawley claimed she had been kidnapped, raped, her body covered with feces, and racial epithets scratched into her skin by a group of white men, including the Dutchess County prosecutor. After months of boisterous public haranguing led by Sharpton, the girl's story was judged untrue by a grand jury. But Sharpton held on to her claims of racial abuse like a bulldog, never fully facing up to the reality that in this case, racism had been out-and-out invented. The good news is that poverty pimps may die a natural death. Like the dinosaurs, they may simply become extinct. One reason is that they're losing their base of voters. While the 1990 census showed that more than 9 million black Americans still lived in nearly total racial isolation, primarily in urban ghettos, it also signaled an historic change in black migratory patterns. Blacks started moving to the economic growth areas, out of the cities the poverty pimps had killed in the Northeast and the Midwest. Poverty pimps may also be annihilated by the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Miller v. Johnson. It ruled that gerrymandering, the practice of partitioning electoral districts primarily based on the race of their residents, was unconstitutional. This ruling signifies a turning point for black politicians in the future. Potentially, it means that they will no longer be able to isolate ignorant black trash constituencies and operate off poverty pimp platforms of welfare-based pork barrel. Instead, they will have to answer to a broader base of informed voters and deliver meaningful benefits to them. They will have to embrace mainstream American professional statesmanship.